If we move forward together, we can keep 1.5 degrees C alive. But there's an old saying in the US, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. And we don't want to end up someplace else. So how do we meet the 1.5? Well, the IPCC put out its 2021 report, and this is the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees C for keeping global average temperature at that rise above pre-industrial levels. We can see that to have a good probability of meeting the 1.5, our carbon budget is from 300 to 400 gigatons of CO2. That's how much we can put into the atmosphere. So what does that mean? Well, we're now putting in about 40 gigatons of CO2 a year. This year we'll put in slightly less. But if we look at many of the pledges that are being made to phase out CO2 emissions by 2050, if we follow a straight line down, that's 600 gigatons. That's way over the 300 to 400 gigatons. That's our carbon budget, our 1.5 degrees C carbon budget. So that doesn't work. That's too much. So how do we meet the 1.5? Well, many scientists and countries and organizations are calling for a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions by the year 2030. If we follow that line down and we meet that target, we keep doing what we've been doing to meet that target, then we will phase out CO2 emissions by the year 2040, and that's 400 gigatons. That gives us a 67% chance of meeting the 1.5. And to have an even better chance, if we get to a 65% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030 and then phase out by 2040, that'll be 340 gigatons, and that'll give us over a 67% chance. So a 50 to 65% reduction between now and 2030 and a phase out by 2040 gives us a high probability of meeting the 1.5. So what does that mean? Well, this is how we see all emissions, how it's presented usually. Building operations, 27%, this is global. Industry, 43%, transportation, another 23%. However, this is a little misleading because buildings is responsible for 10% of all global emissions, and the infrastructure that goes along with buildings and the other construction, such as roads and site work, things like that, and even interiors, that's under other construction, that's another 10%. So you could see that the built environment is responsible for close to half of all global emissions. So how does the world change? It's interesting to look historically to see how we can do it and what the time frame is for doing that today. This was late 1800s. This is a pre-industrial city, just about the time of the Industrial Revolution getting started. And you can see that buildings are not tall, 3 stories maximum, you could walk up, and all masonry buildings, very small spaces and small windows. So how did we get from there to this today? This is Toronto today. You can see skyscrapers with lots and lots of glass, all glass facades. How did we go from pre-industrial times to modern buildings? Well, the first modern building was the Bauhaus. That's considered the first modern building. And here you can see structure moves inside the building. We don't have bearing masonry walls anymore. We have columns, pinpoint loads, and beams and slabs. So we can open up the floor plan and hang the exterior wall off the structure so we can make it all glass. Then we can get light into spaces. So that was 1925. So what was going on in 1925? Things were pretty primitive. When the first modern building was done, there was the Model T truck. We didn't have television. We couldn't make transatlantic calls, for example. So things were pretty primitive. And back then, with the Industrial Revolution starting in the early 1900s, conditions were really bad, and the architecture and planning community got together to address those conditions. People were dying at emphysema. Coal was being burned right in the middle of housing developments in cities. So they got together and said, this is untenable. And they set out kind of utopian environmental reform principles: function-based zones, get the housing out of the industrial areas, make them high-rise housing blocks, use all that glass to get solar exposure, open up the floor plan. Le Corbusier developed his 5 points toward this new architecture, which was a column wall separation. So you had columns, so you could free up the facade design and use horizontal windows and lots of glass and free up the plan. So this was the beginnings of the modern movement, and they laid out these principles. That was in 1928. By 1932, those principles and modern architecture came to the US in a big exhibit in 1932 at the Museum of Modern Art, and they called it the International Style. We can now take what was going on in Europe and bring it to the US and recreate it here. By 1939, we had the Johnson wax building. You can see a big open floor space with pinpoint columns, beautiful, beautiful space. And by 49, you had the Glass House by Philip Johnson as a statement. This was a single glass, all glass house in New Canaan, Connecticut, a very cold climate, because fossil fuels were cheap. We could climate control any interior environment. And we were often running and developing high-rise, single glass, all glass buildings, because we can climate control them. And energy was very, very inexpensive. By 56, we had entire cities based on the modern planning of the modern movement. So how long did it take to go from the Bauhaus, which was the first building, and the Congress of Modern Architecture, the development of it, all the way to the Lever House? From the Bauhaus to the Lever House took 27 years. That's it. And we did all of that. We changed the world with those design principles and those designs with primitive tools. The only thing we had back then was T-squares and triangles and pens that we had to dip in inkwell. It took years to do one set of construction documents, and we can only do really roughly rectangular buildings because we couldn't dimension a curve and get it built. We didn't get the first ink pen till 1960 and the first laptop computer till 1991. So we changed the world in 27 years with primitive, really primitive materials and tools at our disposal. We now have 20 years, 10 years to get to that 50 to 65% reduction, and then another 10 years to phase out all carbon emissions by the year 2040. Now, at COP, we've issued a communique, and we're asking the countries to pledge to get to a 50 to 65% reduction by 2030. If they do that, then they'll be on track for a zero CO2 emissions by the year 2040, and we can meet the 1.5. So the largest professional organizations in the world, representing over 1 million people, have signed on to this pledge and will work to meet the 50 to 65% reduction by the year 2030, zero by 2040, and are calling upon governments to do the same. Also signed on to the communique are over 60 of the largest architecture, engineering, and planning landscape architecture firms in the world, responsible for over $300 billion in annual construction, pledging to help the countries and get the built environment down to these targets. So what are the guiding principles that we're setting out today for the built environment to make this change happen? Well, for new buildings and renovations, we're calling for all new buildings to be designed zero carbon today. That means no on-site fossil fuels. We do that by designing efficient buildings, electrifying them, and using renewable energy for that electricity, either on-site, mostly on-site if we can do it, and then bring it in off-site for whatever else we need. And we're asking cities and jurisdictions to implement zero codes, because we have zero carbon codes today. And if they implement them, then all new buildings will be zero carbon. What about all the materials and construction to build all these new buildings that we're going to build between now and 2040? Well, we're calling for carbon reductions, embodied carbon reductions in steel and concrete of 50% by 2025, and then zeroing out carbon emissions in steel and concrete by the year 2030, and then whole buildings zero by 2040, 50% by 2030. Why single out steel and concrete? Because steel and concrete are responsible for half of almost all industrial sector emissions. That's everything that's made. Just two materials are responsible for half. And so we start with those two materials, we can get very large reductions very, very quickly. So what about all those existing buildings out there? Well, we know that a very small number of large buildings in cities all around the world, 5% or less than the total number of buildings in the city, are responsible for about half of a city's building sector emissions. And then the rest, the other 95% or more of buildings, are responsible for the other 50% of building sector emissions. So we developed a two-part strategy for getting all buildings to zero. First, big buildings. Start with big buildings. Mandate that they must get to zero carbon by 2030. It's not that difficult. They just get rid of on-site fossil fuels, electrify, and use on-site or off-site renewables to produce that electricity. And we're asking for local jurisdictions to pass policies and ordinances and mandates for that to happen with all big buildings. There are just not that many of them, and it's easy to get them under control. And usually with the very big buildings, the people who own the big buildings and companies who own the big buildings have the wherewithal to do it. And then for the small buildings, we give them out to 2040. Again, electrify and use renewables, and do it at intervention points, at places, at times when these small buildings are going to be renovated, at point of sale, when they undergo a renovation, when equipment gets old and it has to be replaced. Then we electrify and use renewables, and we're asking for policies and incentives for building owners to do that. That's how we get the building sector to zero carbon by the year 2040, the built environment by the year 2040. So this is what the timeline looks like. We're issuing the communique today at the COP in Glasgow, calling for all new buildings to be zero carbon immediately. And then work toward reducing the embodied carbon of carbon and steel, so that by 2025, we get a 50% embodied carbon reduction in concrete and steel. And then by 2030, we phase out embodied carbon in carbon and steel. So it'd be essentially clean materials. And we have alternatives that we can use now. If concrete and steel does not meet these targets, we have mass timber, cross-laminated timber, glue-laminated timber. Bamboo is now starting to become a material, and there's all sorts of other materials that are very low carbon. We're also saying that by 2030, big buildings need to be zero carbon in building operations. And then out to 2040, all materials for all buildings need to be really zero carbon. And by that time, then we get the small buildings to zero carbon building operations. That's how we transform the entire built environment between now and 2040. And we're getting quite a bit of help. Solar is now the cheapest electricity in history. And that was starting last year. And we have all the tools that we need to get this done very, very quickly. We can design buildings very, very quickly, get the drawings done, and get them built and renovated. So how are we doing? Let's take a look at the US. This is traditional. Traditionally, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, not even 1995, as floor area increased, so did energy consumption of the building sector, and so did CO2 emissions, because all fuels were essentially fossil fuels. So as you built more buildings, you had increases in energy consumption and CO2 emissions. But something happened in 2005. From 2005 to 2020, floor area increased. We kept building. We actually added 53 billion square feet to our building stock in the United States. But look what happened to energy consumption. Energy consumption flattened out and actually went down slightly. So it didn't keep up with floor area. We were building, but not using any more building operations energy. That's because buildings coming in were being more efficient and we were renovating buildings down. But look at the drop in CO2 emissions. So as we kept building and renovating, we also kept using cleaner and cleaner fuels. And this last few years, we've been using mostly renewables, switching to mostly renewables. And so we're now in the US, we have a 30% reduction in CO2 emissions in the entire building sector in the US, even though we've added 53 billion square feet to our building stock. This decoupling of growing building floor area, growing, and emissions reducing is unprecedented in US modern history, and it illustrates that it can be done, and it can be done quickly. So this is what we're projecting for the US. We're down 30% now from 2005 levels. Our administration wants to clean up the grid by 2035. If we do that and provide some incentives, which they've just done for energy efficiency and electrification, we expect the building sector in the US to reduce its building operations emissions by 72% from the year 2005 by the year 2030, and then get to zero emissions easily by the year 2040. So how are we doing globally? Well, worldwide, since 2010, the last decade, we've added 22% to our building floor, a huge amount of floor area worldwide. This is energy use. Energy use has not gone up as fast. So we're beginning to see a decoupling of energy use. In fact, in the last year, because of COVID, it's gone down slightly, 1%. But we see a flattening out in 2018 and then this slight reduction. So we're beginning to see this happen. What happened in the US over the last 15 years is beginning to happen globally. And here we see emissions, and this is very promising. We can see this decoupling of emissions and floor area taking place. And in the last year, it's happened because we switched almost exclusively to renewables. And this just out in 2020, this past year, where we see that major drop, renewable power was the only energy source for which demand increased while consumption of all other fuels declined. And that's responsible for this huge decline in emissions in the global building sector over this past year during COVID. We've got to keep that up. So we've issued the COP26 Communiqué. We're calling for a 50 to 65% reduction by 2030. That puts us on track for zero by 2040. We're ready, and we are already walking the talk, so they say. And if we move forward together, we can easily keep the 1.5 degrees C alive in our sector. Thank you so much.